going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge tonight. I would normally not share this type of thing because I've had guests in the last year come and attend service. Sometimes they come and they're people that I've just said, you know, you're welcome, and call the 800 number, and some folks are closer in association. But kind of interesting because, as I've told you, it's always the same story with me. It's your responsibility to bring guests. I have other things I'm responsible for. And in my kind of inner circle of people that I may associate with, I'm mindful that if somebody wants to ask me a question, I've got some close friends who are, I don't know, they say they believe in God, but don't know too much about God. I'm always open if they want to ask me a question, if they'd like to have a discussion, but I don't push things on people. I don't believe in that. I believe if the Lord really wants that individual, believe me, He's going to do all the prompting to get that individual to say, you know, why don't I come to church, or I'm going to start listening. That'll happen. But I don't shut the door either. That's a perfect case in point of this. Last Sunday I had guests. I did not ask and say, would you like to come? But in fact, was asked if they could come. And I said, absolutely. Now what's interesting is, and this makes for an interesting situation, when you have people that come into the church that you personally know that are from a different perspective. The father and the daughter are both very Catholic, and the friend or companion is of no religion and doesn't really think that too much exists. So this was an interesting situation for me, because not only did I had to deliver the message that I'd planned to deliver, but in the back of my mind, while I am trying to deliver my message, I can't help but thinking that the Lord had to work all this out, because, you know, to deliver a message that talks about those that are in the process of perishing and those that are being saved, which is a universal message to the church, but couldn't be more truer to people who essentially want nothing to do with God or the church, or have no interest. And I could not, the whole time I was speaking, I could not get that out of my head. And I'm sure we have people that come into the church as your guests, or people who attend, who are, you know, are on the fence about this whole Christianity thing, and Jesus Christ isn't a foggy, question mark on the table here. But when the rubber meets the road, it's people that you know. It was very challenging for me to concentrate, because this thought kept popping back. I had to keep suppressing it. God, you have such a great sense of humor. But it's interesting to hear how people that you know, that you have association with, how they perceive either the church ought to be, or their understanding of the church. It's always interesting here, their understanding of the church. And you find out real quickly that most people are very misguided as to what the church should be. And it's difficult. I came out of that whole tradition. It's very difficult to break away from the absolute pomp and ceremony of it all. It's just very difficult to come into a setting where there is no pomp and there is no regalia and there is no procession, to actually be forced to listen to something. Apart from that, one of the commentaries was, oftentimes as they go to Mass, they've got revolving priests, and sometimes it's a priest from India who has a very thick accent, very hard to understand. You can't understand anything. He might as well have been speaking in Latin or in Italian, it didn't matter, even though he was speaking in English. Then apparently they had and I hear all these stories and I think, that's terrible. But something that made me smile, because it is a direct reflection of what I experienced, is I had told one of my staff, I said, I know these individuals won't have a Bible, and I knew that I was going to be reading from, so I said, make sure that you have a Bible, so they're able, at least one Bible between the three of them, to follow along. It's nothing worse than sitting there and you have nowhere to look. And when my guests were leaving, the girl who is my friend, she said, I never had a Bible before. And it reminded me of me. It reminded me of what I went through. And I went through phases of, I couldn't put the Bible down once I had it. I had to read everything in it. I had to read from cover to cover, and then went back for things that were riveting and things I didn't understand. And then I went through a phase of being angry because nobody told me that I could have a Bible. You don't need one. And don't ask any questions. The common answer if you have a question is, you don't really need to know that. Or someone else will answer you, or at another time, or that's an inappropriate question, even though you're asking about the things of God. Anyway, so I think I'm smiling over this because there's so many delightful things that keep me in check. God is a great way of showing me sometimes where I need to stop and slow down. I mentioned the Moravians. And of course, not everybody is familiar with church history. And so I just said, it's under the banner of Protestantism, but it's a long history, and maybe another time, because I don't want to bore people who maybe don't want to hear this type of history. But I thought I would, a nice little segue, I thought I would share some interesting thoughts in history. While I'm not answering that individual's question, I'm actually talking to you now about the Moravians. And there's a very interesting, we'll call it God's hand in all of this, that you have to go back. If you remember when we did the presentation on Wycliffe, and it's Anne of Bohemia that comes, and she brings Bibles, she brings books and Bibles, and she also brought, at that time, one or two, maybe three, that became students of Wycliffe. But if you start tracing back, really starting at about Anne of Bohemia, you get to piece together from the 40s, 60s forward, a lot of we'll call them the breadcrumbs of the Reformation. So from the time of Wycliffe forward, but a lot of things that I even haven't really thought, that's an important thing that should be shared. But getting back to Anne, who it is well known and well recorded in history. This is years, 150 plus years, maybe more before the Reformation. She was brought up and learned the scriptures, which was unusual and uncharacteristic, and actually treasured being able to read the Gospels, which is also interesting, and also came to the conclusion at a very young age that there was something wrong with the Roman Catholic Church, its teachings. You have to remember that she was the eldest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, the fourth, Charles the Fourth. So there's a great dynamic there to have your father be the Holy Roman Emperor. That doesn't necessarily make a great statement that the daughter is saying there's a question on the table about the teachings of the Catholic Church. And she was very young. These questions and obviously rejection of much of the Catholic doctrine had to be before she married the king, the boy who became King of England. And I think they got married he was 15 and she was 16, the King of England, and she became queen, but she was Anne of Bohemia. He was 15, she was 16. So all this had to happen before she got married to him. The rejection of the teachings of the Catholic Church, and basically she was in her own right a protester. It's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting things, but she is the one who brings books and Bibles, which is the Wycliffe connection. And probably very interesting is because she became Queen of England, protected Wycliffe when things started to get a little, obviously she protected as much as she could, but her story is she doesn't live very long. She dies at 27 from the plague. But when she dies, the people that came from Bohemia, from her homeland, they take a lot of Wycliffe's teaching and writing, many of his students that were from her homeland, and they go back to Bohemia. And this begins the roots that essentially the books and manuscripts and the teachings that are brought back are the genesis of the transition and transformation of Huss's turnaround from rejecting the Catholic doctrine to becoming a reformer himself in his homeland. And I don't know if we look at these people as educators or as educated as we should, but here's someone who was a doctor and teacher of philosophy at the University of Prague, and the core of the Czech Reformation was birthed there at that, what they called the Bethlehem Chapel, where he did a lot of his preaching in that general area. From that, of course, we know that he was burned at the stake. They tried to shut him down, and of course he wouldn't. And after the Council of Constance met, they decided he was a heretic and he needed to die, and they burned him at the stake. But his followers that became the Hussites, and a branch of those people who were the Moravians, who then it branches out, and it all kind of streams from there. So it's kind of interesting to follow the history of all of these and their Protestant spin-offs. And my fascination, I told you I was reading an article and doing some studying on their missions to Greenland, which I found fascinating, but I had to read a little bit more to find out that they weren't the first missionaries to Greenland. The Danish Lutheran were. But apparently the king at the time was very impatient and said, the Lutherans are taking too long, and gave permission for the Moravians to go and do their work. So it was a joint effort there. It's kind of interesting. But that whole history is very, very fascinating. In the process, if you're interested in any of this, great, but there's something about these people that is noteworthy. And they did have some strange doctrines. There may be a half dozen things that we would say, well, that doesn't necessarily fit what we would commonly say is the overall perspective of most Protestant denominations' ideas or theology. But where they had it right, and this is kind of an interesting part of this, you almost have to trace back their history to see what birthed these people into being so committed. And when I say this, it's going to sound strange. They were committed Christians, but they were committed to their community. During the kind of transition between Catholic and Protestant and a wave of Catholic massacre that took place to get these heretic, not yet Protestants, but in the Protestant movement, to recant. And they either did, these were the Moravians, they came from Bohemia, that whole general area. If they would not recant, they would be put to death. In fact, there's a artwork that depicts at least 50 or 75 individuals hanging off of one giant tree, which is supposedly a historical rendering of the effects of what happened. The Catholics basically took matters into their own hands, and many of these people fled to Germany, to the shelter of Count Zinzendorf. And he basically becomes the hub for these people, a refuge for them to be able to keep their community of, let's call them fathers, together. And it is in that community, this is what's interesting, it's in that community, more refugees, as we'll call them, religious, spiritual refugees, are showing up. And this, what's called, I think, Herrnhut was the place that became the hub. That was Zinzendorf's estate, I guess, and that then became the hub for these people for a time. But there were so many people coming in that I believe it was under 2 or 3 of the, we'll call them the higher ranking, I don't know if they had overseers or what, and Zinzendorf that sat down and said, we have to have a form of a treaty of unity amongst the believers here if we're going to settle and be a community. And essentially wrote down terms in this agreement that everybody who was somebody had to sign off on, that inevitably, this was brought on because there were so many people coming in, that people who were professing to have different teachings and kind of a little bit of a circus going on. This brought about this Treaty of Unity, which birthed the movement into being called the, I don't know exactly what the name translates to precisely, but like the Unity of the Brethren, which essentially became their banner movement. And as that compound grew in size, anyone who came into that compound was essentially committed to this bond of unity, which then morphed itself into some weird things like to shun the appearance of certain things. Women would dress a certain way. You know, they would have to wear white bonnets, it morphed into, we're all going to have this same, because it was a koinonia community, and a lot of people who were poor didn't have very much. We're all going to look the same. So a lot of times the Moravian people at a later point were mistaken for, because they later settled much later in the United States, they got confused with Amish and either the Shakers, or it was the Shakers, or the Quakers. They got confused because they all tended to wear this very similar garb. But anyway, it's a very interesting history about this bond that they essentially had to have. And if you read the history of these people before they branched out and began to do their world missions, it's a remarkable one that they even could manage such cohesiveness in a community. That borders on some of the cults we've seen, right? Build these fantasy land things that don't exist. But these were actually biblical doctrines. There wasn't, Jonestown or something. This was living very biblically and very soundly, but it's very fascinating that they could have this type of bond agreement, and everybody was in a unified mind over this. That mindset enabled them to do a lot of work which most people, for maybe many other reasons, and maybe it's doctrinal, they don't talk too much about this, but they essentially took what they had, which was very little, and set out on a journey to go into all the ends of the earth. And this mention of an article I was reading on their missions to Greenland is fascinating. So much so that I think by 1900, they left Greenland, and who knows, but it is recorded that the missionaries said they had Christianized whom they could. In other words, they had covered the territory, which is really interesting. What's equally interesting is their trip and their missionary endeavors in America. And you really find the kernel of their endeavors in Pennsylvania, which seems to be where a lot of different streams of the Protestant movement settled. It's very fascinating, especially Bethlehem and Nazareth. Those two towns have an incredible amount of history regarding these people. In fact, there is a cemetery in almost the center of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And the stones are flat in the ground. And it's interesting, their missionary work that carried over here is really revealed in the stones that are on the ground. Joseph the Mohican, buried here, converted, or came into the brotherhood or whatever. Most of the stones have some message that, it's not really a message, but we can look at those and say, this is kind of something that I think is history well covered up, or maybe even forgotten, unless you live in those parts, which is replete with all kinds of interesting Protestant history. But they settled there. They did have a lot of missionary endeavors this is kind of a funny one. They went to Georgia. I think at the time of Oglethorpe or something, they went to Georgia, and they tried to do their mission work there, and it wasn't a success by any means. But they just so happened to run into a man by the name of Wesley, just randomly, who was going through some interesting spiritual trials of his own. Kind of interesting that they had an encounter, and they were the leader of the Moravian group. And it's written in Wesley's Chronicles. It's written about this encounter. You can read about it. It's kind of interesting, his take on these people. They were very calm in the face of no matter what was going on. They were, and he goes on to elaborate their whole demeanor and how they were very receiving. And that's one of the criticisms that other Protestant groups had of the Moravians, which is essentially they were very, they were the antithesis of sectarianism. In other words, we do what we do here. This all sounds good right now. We do what we do here. We don't judge you for doing what you do. But in certain parts of their mission work, what you do over there got grafted on and watered down their own message. So their very own, not having a clear-cut theological standing on certain things allowed the morphing of other doctrines to be grafted on, which were not Protestant at all. In fact, had Catholic leanings. So it's all kind of very interesting to see, you know, when you kind of dig out this history. There's a lot of good stuff that you can kind of glean. So you know how much I love history. But I was gripped by the one thing, which was, it was not that the Lutherans, the Danish or Denmark Lutherans, it's not that they had not made a translation for the Inuit. Apparently, that they were so slow in doing what they were doing that they basically had basic communications and an explanation of the gospel and perhaps some scant phrases or verses that they were, but it took someone to translate into the Inuit language. And as I said, that was what gripped me, was they didn't have a word for bread. So what would they, how would they explain, give us this day our daily bread? Give us this day our daily seal. And I thought that was very interesting. It's an interesting translation. I've heard of a lot and I've read of a lot. I haven't, that one kind of takes the, I want to say takes the cake, but I take the seal too. But kind of interesting. And these that we're translating into the Inuit language, remember that translation would have to be probably 75 years after, maybe even, the timeline is pretty close to the first Bible printed in America, the Eliot Bible. So there was already, but that was in the Indian language, not the same as Inuit, of course, whole different situation. But you can begin to see how even Bible translation played a huge role for properly explaining the gospel. I mean, I don't even know how in far-flung lands where they didn't have a translation, who would believe such a thing? You know, and then I think back to, of course, well, we only have to look in our Bible. Here's Paul going and preaching to a bunch of pagans, and there is no Bible. Who would believe such a thing, right? Except he spoke their language. So this kind of interesting stuff I thought I would share with you, because there's a lot of history that we can just gloss over. We can focus on the morning star of the Reformation. We can focus on Martin Luther. But the events that I just described regarding Anne of Bohemia, which is, of course, much before Luther, and many of the events, including Huss, which is what, well, Huss is at least some 60 years before Martin Luther began the movement that became the Reformation. So it's kind of interesting to see how God's hand had control over history to put the right people in the right place. Anne with her Bible and her love of the Word of God, not having departed from erroneous teaching. It's quoted in one book. To protector of Wycliffe, bringing those students who would then go back to her homeland, who would plant the seeds for Huss, and you just see the marvel of how God preserved, and there wasn't a gap of time. There was always, in some place somewhere, there was always somebody as a herald. Even in Anne's time, before she left her homeland, there were people in their own way were the precursors to Reformation thought. I think one of the leaders was, I think his name was Milsic, and there's another one, it starts with a J, his name escapes me. There are at least 3 or 4 main preachers, but they obviously, there was no Reformation movement. But there was, you can even go further back from that and follow that path. You'll find God's hand to make sure that somehow the truth prevailed. And that's why I love all the church history that you can read up on, because it lets you see that no matter where in the world at any given time, God had people. And they may have had quirkiness about them, or they may have taken a wrong turn here or there, but God had people delivering the message, including bringing it right to this soil in our own country. And diversity that brought it, but here we are, and here we still stand. It's kind of a miracle. But anyway, I'd like to share the history, but then I thought, these poor people, they're going to be like, huh? Maybe this is too boring for them. You got to love church history and really see God's hand in all this. And then you stand back and you say, people tend to think, oh, God disappeared after the last book was written, and that's it. No, God's been well in control. And even in what I'd call the strange times we're living in right now that look really about as godless as you can get, and as schismed as maybe the schism of the popes, maybe even worse. We're a split country and a split people. And everybody, I think, who talks, at least in the political universe, who is talking about my side and yours, has forgotten we're Americans. And we are Americans, some here for generations and some for a generation or so, first generation. But what made this country great and what made it unified, even in all of its fights and even amidst its divisions historically, was the common bond of one God. And the common bond has now turned into, we're so worried about preserving everybody's, I'm going to use a very weird word, we're so concerned about preserving everybody's dainties that we have forgotten what the main thing is about. And this is why these messages on the cross are equally important. They do the same thing. They're the moorings, although the most important message I will get to is the resurrection. But this is at the core of everything. You lose sight of Christ and the teaching of Christ, and know the teaching of Christ alone, as some have said, even the Moravians, they were convinced that as long as you lived according to the teachings of Christ, that's kind of like saying if you can imitate what he said, you'll be okay. No. If you live by faith in him, and God comes in and does his work in you, but you lose sight of the main focus, everything falls apart. And as I referred to Christendom becoming impotent and weak because people have lost focus. One of you closer in my inner circle who has access to send me a text, sent me a text last week of a picture of the Pope, Lamborghini, signed and autographed by the Pope, and you see the Pope posing in a picture with the car. I don't know, maybe that would be a good vocation for him. I don't know. Probably be good at selling cars. Don't know. My point is that the minute you begin to branch out and do other things as your focus, the church loses its focus. Just like this country has lost its focus, it's no different. The church is the same way. Much more important, because I can't say this without really, it's a heartfelt thing. I've said many years, we must be in the last days, but this has to be. Whatever the last days are, whatever that means, men will be lovers of themselves. And we talk about boasters and everything that is aligned with in the last days. We must be in the last days. There's very few people that are seeking out the truth, and the few, and when I say the few could be 100,000, it could be 1 million on the face of the planet. I don't know who the few are. I don't think the few is just a handful. But whoever those few are, they are a minority in a vast sea of people who are completely lost and are in the process of perishing, because either they haven't been taught, like some who have stayed in a place where you can't hear anything, there is no doctrine, there is no preaching, there is no teaching, and therefore in the act of perishing, or in the act of perishing because there is absolutely no interest, no desire, and the world could not give a care about it. It doesn't matter. So I've told you, this ministry is important, and there are ministries that are, when I say dependent and attached to this ministry, who depend on this teaching ministry throughout the week. They don't have 24-hour a day like we do to turn either for themselves, to feed their flock, or some even having their own congregation sit and listen on a Sunday morning and throughout the week. And that's why I said, you who are able to participate, I don't want you to forget that in the backdrop is a huge factor. There are many other things we could get lost in doing. But the focus has been and will continue to be delivering the message out of the book that brings life to some and death to others. And as tragic as that is, it's been going on since the beginning of time. So when I say I'm taking reservations or commitments or new people call in, I want you to know that this ministry is far beyond something that I'm looking at in my time. I think, as I said, no one knows who has been touched or reached by this ministry. We won't ever really be able to know that, I think, until we all are standing together at some point, either standing in His presence or coming back here on horseback. Don't bother learning how to ride now. It's too late for that. I think the Lord will make a way somehow. I know somebody's going to get up there and say, what we need are Velcro pants and Velcro saddles. Yeehaw. That's why I tell you, participating is important. Because not in my lifetime, and not in yours, we won't know. And sometimes the work looks like it's an effort in, or an exercise in futility, and it's why are we doing this, you know? Because you can't see fruit, or the tree is not full of fruit, and therefore, but who knows what seeds have been planted, that just the smallest bloom or blossom that might appear, and maybe we have the blessing to see it, and maybe we don't. But all the fruit is for God's benefit anyway, so what does it matter, by a little or by a lot? So, who knows? All I know is that it's even more important for people to be committed, and taking a page out of those Moravians that had something very, very interesting, that bond of unity. They didn't make that up. They took that straight out of Paul's writing. And I wish to God that the church would be just like that. And when I say the church now, I'm talking about the band of believers who are all looking in the same direction 85% of the time, and spend 15%, maybe more, stabbing daggers in their brother or sister's back, or their method to getting to where they're going is corrupt. I don't know. That we could have the bond of unity. Somebody said it, and I don't know who, it's not my original thought, but can you imagine if the Protestant church actually, and I'm not talking about let's all hold hands because these people over here, they sprinkle and they dip, or these people over, I'm talking about the main thrust of the message that should be heralded from every pulpit. If we had that common bond of unity, the church could do great things again. And I'm not talking about works, I'm talking about being a force and a power that people would look on. And there'd still be people out there laughing and saying it's stupid. Those are in the act of perishing. But there'd be others to look on and say, at least these people are moving in the same direction. And you can't say that about the body of Christ today. It's not. Most people spend most of their time attacking other people. And I'm going to tell you straight up, for the last at least 10, 11, possibly 12 years of my pastorate here, I've had the wonderful privilege of being the recipient, even in the microcosm, of being attacked by people who profess to be believers, profess to have sound doctrine, and yet the behavior is that of a heathen, worldly person out there, not interested in the kingdom of God being built, but building their own kingdoms here on earth. And that is not the bond of unity. That is the bond of ego, discord, and flesh. So when I tell you it's important for me, and I pray these things, and I always say, you know, God can do wonderful miracles. God can bring people who had in the past a Judas spirit or a Judas attitude towards this work or any work that is for the kingdom of God, preaching the message of Jesus Christ. God can work miracles and change people's hearts. He can change their mind. He can make them turn around. He can bring a sorrowful spirit that they recognize, why was I doing this, or why did I do this thing? I'm not saying that he necessarily will, because I equally believe that some people were brought like the parable of the sower. And it says, and when the riches of the world and the troubles or the cares is just choked off, can't take root and dies, or the evil one comes and it's plucked away. So I don't think everybody can, I don't think it's going to work like that, like the preacher that said everybody's going to be saved, even the devil. Well, I guess John got it wrong in Revelation when he talked about that nice lake that someone's going to go for a swim in. It's got to be like a spa lake, not a, like a thermal lake, but not too hot, right? We could do amazing things as a body for the kingdom of God in these last days. So it'll be interesting to see what this next year brings. It's only a calendar date for me, another year older, another year to be with you, another year if God will give me a full year, because I don't take advantage, or I don't think, well, God's just, He just bestower and I just take it all in. I appreciate every day as a gift. But I'm looking forward to see what the Lord will do and the people that He will bring, new people who are just starting their walk, people who are looking for teaching, and people who were here before, who quite frankly, those are the ones that God will work on to bring them into a bond of unity as He builds for the last days what I call the remnant church. So let's keep doing what we're doing. Let's keep faithing. I do need you to get on the telephone, make your reservations, your commitments. You who are listening for the first time, call in and let me know you're listening. The Voices of Faith are going to ask you what city and state you're calling from. At least tell them that. We don't ask you for your information. If you want to give it, you want to give your name, that's fine, but we're not collecting and selling names. We're not in a business of any kind to give out information. So if you call in your information, it stays here. And just call and let me know that you're listening, or maybe you want to get a King's House and a King's Tither number tonight. So I'm going to give you the chance to get on the phone and do it right now. Get busy.
Come into this house, magnify the Lord, lift up holy hands, our hearts in one accord, worship and bow down before